Welcome to today's webinar on emerging carbon removal opportunities in U.S. legislation, organized by the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. I'm David Morrow, Director of Research at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before I introduce our three excellent speakers, some housekeeping issues. All audience members in the webinar will have their audio and video turned off. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions. You can also use the chat function for comments or ask any technical issues that you might have. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Institute's website within a few days. You can find this webinar, this recording, and recordings of past webinars on the website at carbonremoval.info. I'm pleased to be joined today by Deepika Nagabhushan, who is the Decarbonized Fossil Energy Program Director at the Clean Air Task Force, by Giana Amador, Managing Director at Carbon 180, and by Will Burns, the co-director at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. This is a big week for climate policy in the United States, just 3 days after Joe Biden was inaugurated and quickly moved to rejoin the Paris Agreement. So we're going to talk today about some recent developments in US climate legislation and some possible future developments. Deepika, let's turn things over to you.
Thanks, David. I'm gonna try sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly talk about carbon dioxide removal provisions in the recent omnibus package that was passed in December of 2020, so not so long back. Okay, let me move this. What I will cover in my short presentation this morning is I'm going to talk a little bit about the various provisions, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about what that means in the context of technology innovation of the various climate solutions that we're going to need within the CDR space. I'm going to focus on the technological or engineered CDR space, so namely direct air capture and other forms of capture of carbon dioxide. There are definitely provisions that are related to natural solutions and natural carbon dioxide removal opportunities that Giana will cover right after I finish my presentation. So this is just part of the picture. Okay, so the omnibus package that was passed in December last year included what is called the Energy Act of 2020. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of what that looked like, it had, most importantly, bipartisan support of over 70 senators. It's being applauded as one of the most comprehensive federal policy step taken on climate in more than a decade. I believe it's 13 years. It very much focuses on technological innovation or R&D, and there's about $35 billion that have been authorized. And there is a difference between authorized and appropriated. So there is a step that we still have to go, before the money is actually available to be utilized, but the authorization is definitely step one, and it's a great foundational step that this bill provides. And if anybody in the audience was tracking any of the specific bills, such as the Use It Act, Effect Act, Leading Act, Clean Future Act, you'll see that some of the provisions from those bills are included in the Energy Act. And just to sort of also add a little extra context, I just want to also mention that this Energy Act, although we're talking about carbon removal today, this contained provisions on a whole range of topics, including starting from energy efficiency all the way to nuclear technology, and just several various climate solutions and energy solutions that will be necessary for us to reach net zero by mid-century. So that's just a quick overview of what that looks like. And here are some of the provisions that are pertaining specifically to the technological carbon removal technology. So first, a very overarching provision is that the Department of Energy is now required to establish a carbon management program. And the goal of that program would be to develop and advance carbon removal technologies and all kinds of carbon removal technologies, which would include ag and forestry related solutions as well. And another high level move in that provision is to create a carbon removal task force that would advise the Department of Energy, and it would also prepare a report as its first task of the task force to prepare a report that will identify the broad need for carbon removal with respect to how we get to net zero by 2050, what are the barriers and challenges, and how far along are the technologies in terms of development and commercialization, what needs to be done, what kind of programs and policies need to be built and deployed in order to get these technologies advanced and deployed in time for us to meet our climate goals. So this is a really sort of overarching sort of provisions that we've got from a structural standpoint. And then specifically to R&D, which is, as I mentioned, the focus of a lot of these provisions. There is a specific RD&D program that has been authorized. Overall, the authorization number is about $447 million over a period of 4 years. And that would include the objective of reducing costs of these CDR technologies. And that would include all types of CDR, direct air capture with storage, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, agriculture and forestry-based practices, and so on. And so the job, I guess the report will sort of create a platform, and then the R&D program would sort of work to implement on those recommendations. The 447 million also would include grants for FEED studies. FEED study stands for front-end engineering and design. This is a study that is usually done for projects to identify what it would cost to build it, or what kind of engineering equipment you would need, and those kinds of things. So it usually costs millions of dollars. So for projects that are using newer technologies, it's always useful to have these kinds of grants that sort of reduces the risk. So very useful, and especially for doing large scale demonstrations for direct air capture. There's also DAC prizes. So, it's sort of a way of identifying technologies, having a competition, and identifying technologies that are either pre-commercial or already commercial, and giving them prize money to deploy projects at a commercial scale. And a part of the R&D effort is also to support building of several DAC direct air capture test centers that will again help with the R&D, help with the cost reduction and commercialization going forward. But with CDR, it's important to understand, at least from a technological CDR perspective, that capture is just one piece of the puzzle. You have to do something with the CO2 once you capture it. So storage becomes a very important part, or for instance, there are other options also, like utilization of the stores of the CO2. So I also want to highlight some of the related provisions in the Energy Act that it's not exactly carbon capture or direct air capture, but it's what happens to the CO2 after. I'm going to skip the first one. I'll come back to that. I think I should have kept it as a third point, but let me start with this point number 2, which is there is authorization of about $800 million for over 4 years that has been authorized to validate, test, and demonstrate large-scale carbon dioxide sequestration in geologic formations. And this is extremely important because it's our biggest resource in the US in terms of getting rid of CO2 from the atmosphere. or from any source for that matter, but in this case, the atmosphere. And carbon utilization is another area where we need more research. And so there's $280 million being authorized for over 4 years to do some additional research and development in that area. Now I'll just touch upon 45Q. I'm suspecting that most people in the audience already are aware of what the 45Q incentive is, but just to round it out, I'll just sort of mention really briefly. 45Q is a tax credit that was modified most recently in 2018. And that basically provides $35 a ton to $50 a ton for capture and storage of CO2. This does also apply to direct air capture, but however, it is relative to the costs of direct air capture today. 45Q incentives are not entirely sufficient to push projects over the finish line. So, but however, it is very much helpful as it can be stacked along with other incentives for deployment of projects. And currently there is one direct air capture project in construction, in development, which does utilize this opportunity, this incentive. One of the changes that we saw in the Energy Act is that there was previously a commenced construction deadline for eligibility, which was December 31st, 2023. Now that has been extended by 2 years, given the fact that the IRS took about 2 years to write down guidelines, sort of making up for that time, giving developers more time to sort of figure it out and get their projects financed. So that really is very helpful for project deployment, at least for those specific technologies that are at that stage, but there are several that are not, which is why R&D is so important. And that brings me to my last slide, to just sort of to lay out a context why these R&D provisions are so important. I just wanted to sort of put that in the context of how CATF thinks about innovation of technologies. Basically technologies have to, when they're emerging and they're expensive relative to the application of the technology, what happens is you need you definitely need government funding or funding to do more research and development so that you can cut costs, you can innovate, you can deploy maybe 1 to 5 commercial scale projects just to see how you can change things, how you can improve things so that the costs come down. That's the learning curve. Once you get to the point where the costs have come down to a reasonable level, then targeted incentives such as the 45Q or any other kinds of policies can sort of help bridge the gap between where it has reached due to R&D and innovation and what the market may be willing to pay for it. But once that is done and that helps deploy some more projects, then the technologies hopefully at a point where the costs are so low and there is sort of a well-oiled ecosystem of manufacturing components and deploying these projects really fast, that the costs are now very predictable and low. And at that point, there might be a need for just a generic market-wide, economy-wide incentive, like even a carbon price or something that resembles a carbon price that sort of cuts across all solutions that can then be able to take the technology towards wide-scale deployment, which is where we need to go. So in this context, we're at the top stage right now. So that's why R&D is very, very significant at this time for carbon removal technology, specifically in the technological space. So I just want to put that in context for the audience. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, and you can hand it back.
Great, thank you very much, Deepika. That was great. I'm going to turn things over now to Giana.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Deepika. Really great and informative presentation on some of the ones that came out of the omnibus. I am going to share my screen really quickly. And hi, everyone. Again, I'm Giana Amador, Managing Director at Carbon 180. We're a nonprofit that really focuses on championing carbon removal solutions by uniting science, business, and policy. Today, I'm going to chat a little bit about what the current landscape looks like, follow up on Deepika's presentation, and share some of the wins in the omnibus around land sector solutions, and then really dive into what are some of the things that we expect around carbon removal from the Biden administration, as well as Congress this year. So just starting off with the current landscape, I think the omnibus really represents one of the biggest wins for the carbon removal field. We've seen a continuous ramp up of funding through the annual appropriations process for R&D for carbon removal solutions. About 5 years ago, it was really around like $10 million ever had been spent on negative emissions technologies. And just last year, we saw that increase to $68 million for direct air capture and carbon utilization. So the $447 million that Deepika outlined really represents a huge win and a significant investment from Congress in these solutions, which also means that Congress is continuing to realize and emphasize and invest in carbon removal as a critical climate technology. In addition to the omnibus, there have been a number of new bills that have been introduced around carbon removal. So a couple that I just wanted to mention up front was first the CREATE Act, which would create an interagency working group and coordination structure across all of the agencies that do carbon removal related research to make sure that we're sharing lessons and coordinating and able to sort of develop these solutions in a cross-disciplinary way. On the agriculture side, one of the bills that has gotten bicameral and bipartisan support is the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which would, through the USDA, create a third-party verification program for carbon offsets that promote carbon sequestration both in soils and in forests. And then I know Will be talking more about the Trillion Trees Act, but there also have been a number of other related forestry bills that have come out, like the Replant Act, that really focus on both preventing wildfires and supporting forest restoration. So we're seeing a lot of movement from Congress and interest in introducing these bills. And I think the omnibus really represents sort of the first major passage of a major carbon removal bill. On the land sector side, we saw increases in funding for on the agriculture side for technical assistance for farmers to implement these practices, as well as an increased focus on research for soil carbon sequestration, particularly around some of the more frontier agriculture technologies. So this is things like genetic engineering or advanced breeding to help find crop varieties that store more carbon in soils than traditional agricultural commodities. So I think those are really big wins as well. The funding levels really in size don't compare to what we're seeing on the sort of tech side, but we're seeing a continuous call out in the bill text, in the bill language, that soil carbon and soil health are really big priorities for these programs. And sort of that direction from Congress is really valuable for these agencies. I wanted to also touch upon the current landscape for the administration. The Biden-Harris administration has continued to signal that both climate change and carbon removal is a top priority for the administration in the first 100 days. And we've seen carbon removal called out specifically on the transition team website, in the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, and in the Biden campaign climate plan. And so I think we have sort of are able to make a reasonable assumption that this is going to be a priority for the administration. In addition to that, some early staffing choices, both at the USDA, within the White House, and at the Department of Energy, are beginning to signal that they're bringing carbon removal experts on, which is a really great sign, and means that we'll likely have more in-house expertise on carbon removal than we've ever had before, and that some of these programs, like the Department of Fossil Energy, which is traditionally focused on traditional CCS or CCS on the electricity sector, might actually sort of shift more to focus on direct air capture or some of these other negative emissions technologies. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's possible in 2021, and I think root that conversation in what really needs to happen for carbon removal to scale and to really meet its potential as a climate solution. Deepika did a really great job of outlining like what is our theory of change and what are the policies that help get us to scale. I like to think of these in sort of three buckets around research, development, infrastructure, and incentives. And so these are sort of the three areas in which we at Carbon 180 and a number of other environmental NGOs will be pushing to see policy support over the next year. And then just touching upon like what I think is going to be possible over the next year and what are some of the changes that could both come out of Congress, either through the next stimulus package, through new introduced bills, or what could actually come through administrative action. I think at the Department of Energy, just based on some of the staffing choices that we've seen, it could be likely that there are some shifts in the DOE programs to really prioritize carbon removal innovation. One of the things that Carbon 180 recommended in our recent transition book was to rename the Office of Fossil Energy to be the Office of Carbon Management and to really focus those research activities on carbon removal. We'd also love to see a continued increase in funding for innovation and specifically the launch of a carbon shop program that would really aim to drive down the cost of robustly verified carbon removal. So that includes solutions on the land sector side and ensuring that we have a durability of that carbon storage, as well as some of the more expensive technological solutions like direct air capture and driving that cost down to less than $100 per ton of CO2 by 2025. And then finally, just sort of extending some of the other tools in our policy toolkit to carbon removal. So designating tech to market support for carbon removal technologies through small business innovation grants or through loan guarantees. And then at the USDA, I think we'll likely see the USDA update their building blocks report that was launched during the Obama administration, and hopefully in that report see some ambitious callouts or goals to ag-based carbon removal. I think it's also likely in upcoming stimulus packages that we may see an increase in research funding for soil carbon and for forestry solutions. And then finally, there's been a lot of talk about tweaking some of the existing conservation programs to sort of maximize carbon storage. So this would be the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and the Conservation Reserve Program. So I think it's a potential for us to see an increase in funding for those programs, as well as a couple of tweaks to hopefully see them prioritize applications from farmers that really maximize carbon storage. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is really what might we see from the White House around carbon removal. I think in the first 30 days, as the Biden administration is ramping up their climate plans, I think we really want to see carbon removal included in relevant climate executive orders. So especially related to net zero climate goals, conservation, or any innovation commitments, we would love to see carbon removal incorporated into that. And then I think in the first year, we'd love to see the establishment of an interagency task force on carbon removal that, similar to what I sort of laid out with the CREATE Act, would really bring together academia, environmental justice groups, labor advocates, environmental NGOs to really help with that interagency coordination and make sure that carbon removal solutions are developed in a really just, equitable, and sustainable way. And then I think in terms of where these sort of policy levers or shifts might happen, there are a couple places to watch. I already mentioned executive orders, but I think another opportunity to see this is in the president's budget and the annual appropriations process. So the president's budget is expected to come out at the end of March or early April. And I think that's where we might see some of these big, ambitious funding recommendations for investment in carbon removal and just climate technologies generally. Through the annual appropriations process as well, we're hoping that Congress continues their momentum and continues to increase funding for carbon removal solutions. And then the last opportunity is really around reconciliation. This is a sort of special process that happens in the Senate that allows them to expedite the passage of bills. So rather than a supermajority, they're actually able to sort of fast track bills and allow them to pass with a simple majority. It's something that's already being discussed for the next stimulus packages, and so I think it's likely that we could see a reconciliation process come forward and the opportunity for carbon removal and for climate solutions to fit into that more generally. So I will pause there and hand it back to David and Will but I think there's a ton of opportunity for what can happen around carbon removal this year, and really excited to continue to build on the momentum that's happened over the past few years.
All right, thank you very much, Giana. Very informative. Let's turn things over to our last speaker, Will Burns.
All right, thank you very much, David. I'm going to share my screen, and because of adverse weather here, I'm going to stay off screen for now to try to preserve some bandwidth. Okay, so on December 9th of last year, Republican Senator Mike Braun of Indiana and Democratic Senator Chris Coons from Delaware introduced legislation which is entitled the Trillion Trees and Natural Carbon Storage Act. The bill comes in the immediate wake of former President Donald Trump's signature of an executive order in October establishing the 1 Trillion Trees Interagency Council to help further the federal government's contribution to the World Economic Forum's 1 Trillion Trees Initiative, which was announced at the forum's annual meeting in Davos in 2020. The Trillion Trees bill is also similar to legislation sponsored by Republican Bruce Westerman from Arkansas in the House. And these initiatives are some of the few that represent bipartisan efforts to address climate change in America. So they're important to look at. So what I want to do is look very briefly at some of the key provisions of the Senate bill, as well as briefly critique these provisions. So first of all, overarching objective of this bill, as provided in its language, is to provide a partnership with the 1 Trillion Trees Initiative at the international level to foster sustainable management, restoration, and conservation of global forests, as well as other ecosystems capable of sequestering carbon dioxide, including grasslands, wetlands, and coastal habitats. So first of all, in terms of the domestic provisions of the bill, within 2 years, the bill provides that the Secretary of Agriculture and the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration are to be tasked with establishing objectives for increasing the carbon stocks of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and so-called blue carbon ecosystems, such as coastal habitats that include tidal wetlands, mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and kelp forests. The overarching goal, according to the bill, would be to maximize increases in carbon sequestration on private, state, tribal, and federal lands by 2030, and every 10 years thereafter, through the beginning of 2100. The bill also provides that measures taken to effectuate this goal should not imperil the ecological integrity of forests, nor should they interfere with sustained yield and multiple uses of domestic forests. Moreover, the bill prioritizes conservation and management of existing forests with a subsidiary goal of planting additional trees. However, to incentivize the planting of more trees, the bill authorizes $10 million for the USDA's Forest Nursery Revival programs to ensure the supply of seeds and saplings for increased domestic planting. In the context of national forests, the bill provides for the construction of computational models to analyze the life cycle forest and grassland carbon sequestration potential associated with the national forest system. It also provides for mechanisms to monitor carbon stocks in blue carbon and grassland habitats. The bill also seeks to facilitate and foster private landowner participation in carbon credit markets by establishment of the Rural Forest Market Investment Program under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The investment program would provide incentives such as environmental impact bonds, which could provide upfront capital to private landowners, loans, and other investment vehicles to enable rural private forest landowners to engage in tree planting projects with the purpose of selling credits in voluntary carbon markets or other recognized environmental markets. Government guarantees in this context would be capped at $150 million for each one of these mechanisms. The bill also provides for commercial grants to institutions of higher learning for research to improve commercialization of cellulosic biochemical products such as biofuels, as well as biodegradable cellulosic bioplastics. There are also provisions at the international level. The bill would task the Secretaries of State and Agriculture, as well as NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, to prioritize partnerships with developing countries and regions that have experienced substantial losses of forests, grassland conversion, wetland loss, and blue carbon degradation, where there is the potential to enhance carbon sequestration and other benefits. The bill provides for financial assistance to such countries and would encourage them to adopt national legislation to protect, restore, and sustainably manage existing or new forests, as well as grasslands and blue carbon habitats. The emphasis is in this initiative is on public-private partnerships to encourage participation by NGOs as well as industry stakeholders. The bill would also establish land management criteria that are intended to support conservation of critical habitats. And then finally, the bill would create the International Forest Foundation, a nonprofit organization to encourage and accept donations in support of international reforestation, restoration, and deforestation prevention efforts. Okay, so those are the key provisions of the bill. What I want to do now is briefly talk about the merits of the legislation, at least as it stands now. One thing that needs to be emphasized at the outset is that tree planting, even at massive scales, is not a panacea in terms of climate. While a 2019 study by Crowther et al. Concluded that planting 1.2 trillion trees could sequester about 830 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which the authors said was equivalent to global emissions in the past 25 years. The methodology of this study has almost been universally panned. More realistic assessments recently pegged the actual figure at about 7% of current emissions. And that's assuming that we can plant over 1 trillion trees, which many people believe an unrealistic task. Now, while this figure of 7% is certainly nothing to sneeze at, it emphasizes the need to secure bipartisan support for more aggressive efforts at decarbonization, as well as a focus on other forms of carbon dioxide removal beyond so-called natural solutions. So again, it's salutary that some of the other CDR options, as were discussed by the two previous speakers, are at least on the agenda at the federal government level, albeit still at a fairly modest level. The assessment of the climatic benefits of tree planting in the United States in the Senate bill focuses on changes in net carbon stocks. However, it fails to take into account the impacts of reduced surface albedo associated with tree planting. What we know is that when we plant trees in the northern hemisphere on areas with high albedo or radiative reflectivity, such as scrublands or areas with lots of snow, it substantially decreases albedo or reflectivity. What this means is that while there are benefits of sequestering carbon in those areas, there are also increases in warming by the absorption of more incoming radiation. And indeed, some recent studies have indicated that planting of trees in the northern hemisphere, in most cases, would offset virtually all of the benefits of carbon sequestration. And in snowy regions, could actually result in a net increase in warming. And that last statistic is particularly significant because most of the studies that map out planting 1 trillion trees assume that about 25% of those trees would be planted in snowy areas primarily to avoid land conflicts. To the extent that this bill does not realistically assess anything beyond net carbon sequestration, it in theory could actually be counterproductive from the standpoint of addressing climate change. Moreover, while the bill provides for incentives to private landowners to participate in voluntary carbon markets, it fails to provide parallel incentives to build up blue carbon projects, despite evidence that these projects could effectuate sequestration of carbon and yield other ecosystem and other co-benefits. And this is also true, and perhaps even more so, in the context of wetlands. Simply too much emphasis, in my opinion, in this bill on incentivizing forests and not some of these other ecosystems that might provide commensurate or even greater climatic benefits and even greater co-benefits. In terms of the international aspects of the bill, while the bill does provide criteria for ecologically responsible tree planting, other initiatives of this nature supposedly have also. But the incentives to obtain carbon credits, as well as to try to fulfill climate pledges, have often resulted in the flouting of such criteria. For example, a study of the German IUCN bond challenge, which seeks to plant over 350 million hectares of forest by 2030, concluded that the initiative is targeting many areas incorrectly identified as degraded or unproductive. In reality, this includes vast areas of ocean ecosystems, open ecosystems, such as savannas, grasslands, and shrubs, which are predominant in developed countries. Overall, as much as 50% of planned international sequestration associated with forests contemplates planting trees in savannas and grassland areas. However, these areas are far from unproductive, often harboring high levels of biodiversity, particularly in developing countries. Large-scale afforestation programs could also substantially denude species-diverse biotic communities in such regions. Moreover, studies indicate that planting forests in these ecosystems could deplete groundwater, which could severely undermine the dry season water supply for many local communities in the Southern Hemisphere. Many also fear that seeking to afforest or reforest an area potentially equivalent to half the area of Africa or more could result in massive land grabs from vulnerable populations that rely on this land for their livelihoods. Such land grabs, often involving violence, have occurred in the past in the quest to sell carbon credits on voluntary carbon markets, as well as under the Kyoto Protocol. It is far from clear in terms of the bill's provisions on stakeholder consultation that there's adequate measures to ensure compliance. An additional safeguard should be included in this bill, such as stringent social license to operate criteria. So I'm going to stop there and say overall, there are certainly benefits to looking at so-called natural climate solutions, including tree planting. However, it is important to do both a granular assessment of the potential benefits of this, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, in consideration of changes in albedo. And it's important to have much more stringent safeguards in place for tree planting programs in the Southern Hemisphere, given the record of these efforts in the past. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Will. We've got a lot of great questions coming in the Q&A box. So I'd like to move to audience Q&A at this point. If all of our speakers could turn on their camera and or audio again, that would be great. If you still have questions that you'd like to ask, please do use that Q&A feature down next to the chat rather than typing them into the chat box, which makes it easier for us to keep track of what we've already answered and what still needs to be answered. All right. Let's start with the first question on the list there about carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery. Right, so it might be worth a moment, maybe Deepika, you could do this for us to say a little bit about what enhanced oil recovery is. And then the specific question that's been asked is whether CDR CCS that allows the fossil fuel industry to use enhanced oil recovery would allow fossil fuel plants and extraction to operate for longer under the guise of being carbon neutral, and how, the questioner asks, can advocates for CDR and politicians avoid the risk of this happening? So Deepika, if you could just give us a quick minute about what EOR is, and then I'd invite anybody to jump in and answer the question.
Okay. This is all, I almost want to say this is an entire webinar of its own, but we'll try to answer the question. Enhanced oil recovery is when oil is being pumped out of an oil field, and then after a point, the pressure depletes in that field, and you need to do something additional to get the oil pumped out. So typically what oil companies would do is to repressurize the oil field by pumping in either steam. Sometimes they use other surfactants that, it's unknown to public. It's sort of proprietary that I don't know if they reveal. And CO2 is also a fluid that is very useful in is very effective in getting the field pressurized and to get oil out. What happens is CO2 mixes with the oil, makes it less viscous, which makes it easier to bring it out. Usually EOR, if you look at the world, it's like less than 5% of how oil is produced. It is not the primary mode of production of any of the oil companies. Very, very niche companies use this method, and I want to keep it open to the others, but there's a lot of questions within this one question. So I definitely want to say that I think carbon removal technologies and carbon capture technologies are going to be needed far more than we'll need to do, then there'll be possibility to do EOR. I mean, we have to actually, there is so much contribution that this technology can do. And as per the 1.5 degree report by the IPCC, there is, there's a lot of contribution that we'll get from carbon capture and carbon removal technologies. And, we'll have to rely on things like dedicated saline storage and geologic formations. EOR will never be the biggest piece of the puzzle. But to answer your question very directly, the current incentive does allow for projects to utilize EOR as one of the options for storage. Few things I want to say about that is that there is still storage that occurs. It's not like there is no storage occurring through that process. So storage is being achieved. Yes, on a life cycle basis, you lose some of that because oil is being produced, but you do not lose all of it. According to the International Energy Agency, you get 63% off the benefit. If you put a ton of CO2 in, store it with EOR operations, you may lose the benefit of about 37% on a global scale, well to wheels, even accounting for increase in consumption of oil. And you do still have the benefit of the 63% of the storage of this CO2 that you store. So on a net basis, you are still reducing emissions, but it is just a stepping stone according to us at CATF. It is not going to be the full thing. And yes, you're right. There are ways to draw more attention to storage away from EOR using incentive design and policy design.
Deepika mentioned that this is a whole webinar in itself. And in fact, we have done such a webinar. I'm going to drop the link to that chat in there, and you can hear Deepika and Will, among others, talk about EOR at more length. Giana or Will, did you have anything real quick you want to say about that before we move on to our next question?
Yeah, just quickly, I think Deepika is totally right. I think there is a climate benefit to implementing EOR. Right now, a lot of the CO2 that's used for EOR comes from natural domes rather than anthropogenic sources. So the extent to which we can offset that with carbon removal does have like a net benefit for the climate. I think that being said, we think a lot at Carbon 180 about the sort of justice and equity concerns, as well as the community impacts of enhanced oil recovery. And so I think in terms of what advocates can do around enhanced oil recovery, one is to increase the regulations around enhanced oil recovery and making sure that there are minimal impacts on communities. And two, like Deepika said, to shift some of those early markets for carbon sourced from direct air capture to carbon utilization in things like concretes and building materials, as well as providing greater emphasis through policy design on ethylene storage. So I think it's really about where we place our emphasis for advocacy and how do we provide a greater basically dollar sign or price incentive for some of these other markets that don't have the same community impacts.
Okay, thank you, Giana. We've got a number of questions that I want to sort of group together and throw out to all of you here about a number of different approaches to carbon removal that haven't come up yet today. So some specific things that were mentioned, ocean carbon removal. There are various ocean-related approaches to CDR, biochar, low carbon, cement or concrete, decentralized capture methods. So what are the prospects for legislative support or policy support for these approaches in the US in the future? And I'll throw in one more related question there about what improvements might be made to the Trillion Trees Act in a new Congress or administration.
I can hop in for the first part of that question. I think the short answer is we need a very large portfolio of carbon removal solutions. The scale that the IPCC sort of estimates that we'll need for carbon removal solutions is really by mid-century, 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. And so that actually can't be met by any single solution. So we'll need to really sort of develop and build out all of the solutions in our toolkit and really see like which are credible, which we can implement at a reasonable cost, and sort of piece together our way to that 10 gigatons. I think in terms of oceans and biochar and some of the other, what I would call are more like frontier technologies, we have less experience with implementing them. We have less research on the credibility or durability of that carbon storage. Really, the answer is research. And I think one of the exciting things is that in the omnibus bill and the carbon removal program that is situated at DOE, it actually doesn't, it calls out a number of those other solutions as priorities for the DOE to look into. And it's not just restricted to direct air capture, even though that's where a lot of DOE's expertise is. So I think we're seeing that sort of portfolio approach being taken by Congress, and absolutely through the annual appropriations process, we would love to see call outs to increase funding for those specific solutions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think things like ocean alkalization enhancement and maybe coastal enhanced weathering are certainly merit further research, though they clearly are very frontier. I don't know how high the prospects are. I think those kind of interventions in a global commons are difficult from a political standpoint. So I think we're going to need more private sector sort of funding for research to demonstrate that those approaches are potentially both effective and relatively low in risk before we'll probably see politicians willing to jump into the water for that.
Okay.
Oh, there was the question about Trillion Trees, right, too, how to improve it. Well, I think it's some of the things that I suggested. I wish there were more incentives for private enterprises in terms of blue carbon and in terms of wetlands protection than there are in the bill. That would help to capture some of the externalities associated with massive wetland loss, for example, and that would yield tremendous co-benefits in terms of ecosystems, for example. The same with blue carbon, where some of these sources can sequester much more carbon in term per unit of biomass than trees, and yield arguably even better ecosystem benefits. And yet the bill seems to be hand wavy in terms of those. It puts those words in there because it knows that it should, but it doesn't provide any kind of incentives to ensure that any of that happens, right? I think that we need a lot more research on this albedo question. One of the Q&A questions indicated that we don't have definitive evidence in terms of what happens in temperate regions. That's true, though we have some evidence that there's still substantial offsetting of the benefits in temperate regions. And a lot of the tree planting in the US may still occur in higher regions where I think clearly there's no net benefit. So we need more research for that. And then finally, we need better safeguards at the international level to ensure that elites don't undermine the interests of the most vulnerable in their own countries in pursuit of carbon credits, which we've seen with the RED Plus program and other programs of this nature. And again, I think the bill's a bit hand-wavy in terms of the safeguards that it provides for.
Thanks. We've got another question in a somewhat different vein. What role do you see for international cooperation, especially with Europe, for carbon removal incentives or policy? Anyone want to tackle that one? I know we're primarily on US legislation. But...
I can start a little bit. I think in terms of international cooperation, one, I think it's great that the US has re-entered the Paris Agreement. One of the things that I think would be great to see in the US's nationally determined contribution is a commitment to deploying carbon removal solutions. I think specifically on the land sector side where we have sort of more experience deploying these solutions, and sort of continuing to call out and have that leadership of, you know, creating a really credible climate commitment that includes carbon removal and is really representative of what the IPCC says we need to do. I think in addition to that, we could see forums like Mission Innovation or the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum be really good avenues to continue to sort of expand the places in which carbon removal is talked about on an international stage, and the ways that the US can sort of share its research findings and continue to collaborate with other countries who are doing similar research. So I think those are a couple areas that just call out to me, though definitely not my area of expertise, and would love to hear the thoughts of others.
I certainly think on trees, given the fact that the US is tying itself to an international initiative, this Trillion Trees Initiative, it should take a leadership role in trying to ensure more stringent methodologies and more stringent protections of interests in the South. We should be working with Germany, for example, to ensure that the bond challenge does a far better job of characterizing land than it's doing now. Large swaths of grasslands in southern Africa that are used by a lot of stakeholders for most of their income are being characterized as unproductive, and they're being expelled in the interest of carbon credits. We have to do better, and countries like Germany and the US have the resources to ensure that those characterizations are done better, instead of simply believing elites at the local level in terms of what's happening on that land.
Right. Let's turn to a question about bottlenecks. So someone in the audience asks whether the main bottlenecks at present are related to funding and tech development, or permitting and regulatory requirements for infrastructure, facilities, or operations of carbon removal. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what the big bottlenecks are. And this questioner also wonders whether the Omnibus Bill's provisions makes any progress on these issues.
Sorry, bottlenecks on development of CDR technology.
Well, on scaling up carbon removal is my interpretation, at least.
I think the main bottleneck is right now bringing the costs down and building some infrastructure, like what Giana said in her three-part theory of change. Infrastructure is so important, and storage is a big part of that. And I think that those are the main, I would say, ecosystem barriers that if we can overcome through R&D and through government support for developing the large-scale storage sites and creation of hub models, I think that that will be a big part of removing those two bottlenecks. And I think that policies like deployment-based policies like 45Q or other things that were mentioned, I think will then sort of come in, sort of activate the remaining deployment piece of it. That's just how I view it, just very briefly to answer that question.
Giana, anything to add there?
I think that.
Okay, great. So we've got a question about suggestions for policy guardrails that could be developed in the US to ensure that CDR doesn't delay emissions reductions or decarbonization of the economy, and to ensure that carbon removal is compatible with the sustainable development goals, right? This is a very common worry that lots of people have about carbon removal. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on policy guardrails.
I do want to say something about, maybe add another little aspect to that question. I think that it will be interesting to differentiate between what might be happening today in the voluntary space, like corporates investing in technology solutions, corporates investing in what they would call carbon reductions, versus what I think at a policy level, we're going to decide, or the federal government might decide, is going to count in terms of compliance. I think that there are two different worlds. I mean, I hope that they come together at some point, but at this point they are separate. So I think that the question around, from a policy perspective, I think that there's a lot of understanding among supporters of carbon capture or carbon removal, that we are just, there is no sort of one or the other. It is a question of and we have to do reduction and we have to do removal, because if we have to meet that net zero goal, we really need to do both and hit the pedal on both. But in the voluntary market, however, because of costs being really, really low for technologies like, for, carbon removal solutions, like for instance, companies investing in things like regenerative agriculture, I know that there is still a lot more to be learned about whether or not and how we would verify the carbon reduction aspect of those kinds of solutions. It's sort of like, so there's that, I think that the question is more applicable to the voluntary side, I think, because in the compliance side, there's a cost aspect that automatically determines what you will do more of. And if carbon removal is more expensive relative to reductions, which it mostly is, you end up not, jeopardizing one for the other. So that's just my overall, take on that.
Okay, great. Oh, sorry. You want to jump in there?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think where that becomes more of a concern in the compliance markets is really around the way that land sector offsets have been used, and just making sure that any land sector removals that we do have that are done in an offset framework really provide durable and credible long-term carbon storage, which I think in many compliance markets, offsets have not sort of like met those criteria. I think I agree that Deepika, with what Deepika was saying, that there's not really a concern that carbon removal becomes like a delay or a replacement for other climate actions. We really need to do both as quickly as possible. But we can provide safeguards and guardrails through, high quality science-driven policy that make sure that there are minimal community impacts, high community participation for where these technologies are being deployed, and also safeguards for environmental harms.
All right, that does bring us to the end of our hour. I'm going to ask if any of our speakers who happen to be available, if they can stick around for a few minutes and try to type out some answers to the remaining questions in the Q&A. We've got a lot of great questions there that would be nice to answer. This webinar and the other webinars will be available on the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy's website, which you can find at carbonremoval.info. It's carbon removal, all one word, .info. You can also find out about upcoming webinars on our website, on our mailing list, on our Twitter feed. So thank you again for your participation and your questions, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again to all of our speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.